Everybody, welcome back to another episode of Dialing In, and today we continue on with some of the great new features in Helix Firmware 3.0, and today I'm going to be taking a look at dialing in the polysustain model that we received in this fabulous new update. Now, a lot of folks might say, what is this polysustain? Well, you're going to find it under the delay category, but that's kind of interesting because I don't know if it can really be considered a traditional sort of delay. What it actually does is kind of what the name suggests. It allows us to play a note, hit the effect to turn on and have it sustain that note indefinitely until we turn it back off. Now you might say, well, what is that good for? Well, there's a number of purposes that are kind of maybe more traditional that we'll talk about, but there's also some creative possibilities here because of the way the folks at Line 6 implemented this and the controls that they gave us. Very interesting stuff. So let's dive over to HXEdit and take a look and see what we have. So what I've done here is I created a quick preset, mostly using my template that I normally have, my compressor and EQ. This one has a little bit of plate verb, a little bit of transistor tape just to add a little bit of ambience to the tone, my normal low and high shelf EQ, and I decided to use the Das Benson Mega amp, which is the new diesel model we acquired in this update, and I threw in a 412 Greenback 25 with a 121 ribbon, which I really liked with this. So this is what this sounds like. Really digging that tone. It was kind of nice. Okay, well, let's forget about that because that's not what this video is about. We go over to our polysustain model. Now, the first thing we're going to want to do is assign this to a foot switch. I'm going to do that right now. I'm going to go to bypass sign and put it on foot switch 7. And that allows me to now turn it on and off with my foot, which is going to be really important because the idea here is that we want to use our feet to turn this on and sustain certain notes. Now, if I just turn this model on, it doesn't really do anything. If I turn it back off, nothing different, okay? So you might say, well, what is the point of this? Well, the point of it is that we would want it turned off until we need it, okay? For instance, if I hit a note, and then I notice I engage it as I hit that note, it sustains that note indefinitely. So I play that again. It just keeps going. Now what you heard there sounded, I don't know if you noticed it, but kind of unnatural, but we'll talk about that in a second. First of all, let's do this. Let's go through what the controls are doing. So we have interval, attack, decay, mod frequency, mod depth, FX level, random depth and random speed, or ran depth and ran speed, and level. Okay, let's talk about these one at a time. So interval tells us that, measured in semitones, much like a lot of the other poly effects, let's say I set this to -12. What that's going to do is it's going to actually sustain the note I'm playing when I engage it, but it's going to change the note down, or notes, because it's a poly effect. It's going to change those down a full octave in this case. So if I turn that off, you'll hear that it actually sustained a note an octave lower, and I can do different intervals. If I wanted 5 semitones lower, so we could almost have it sustain kind of harmonies to what we're playing. What a really cool function that is. Okay, we'll put that back. Attack is going to be how quickly, once we engage polysustain, the note is going to fade in. So if I set this way up at, let's say, 5 seconds, I hit that note. Watch, you'll see on the screen when this goes bright is when I've engaged it, okay? Okay, so it took 5 seconds for it to fade in. We may or may not want that. That's going to be up to us to decide. Decay is going to be the opposite of that. It's going to tell us how long it's going to take for the note to fade away once we disengage the pedal. Let's put that up at, say, 5 seconds. you'll see that when I disengage it, it takes 5 seconds for it to go back down. We'll set those back to normal. Now, mod frequency and mod depth. This is going to be a modulation effect we have on the sustained note. Now, if you noticed one thing, when I was playing this note here, let's say I was ending a solo and I was adding a nice vibrato to it. If you notice, when I engaged the polysustain, it sounded very unnatural. Watch. The note that I finished with had vibrato that I was adding, and then all of a sudden we went to this static note as if somebody played. That's not really how guitar players play. A lot of times we'll play a note and add some nice vibrato to it. So watch what happens when we bring in the mod depth, and I'll bring it up to maybe 3.5 or so. It's adding what seems like a vibrato to the sound. Isn't that nice, right? Now, what if I was vibrating at a certain tempo, let's say? And then when we engage this, so the mod frequency is going to determine how fast or how slow that kind of modulation vibrato sounds. So I could set that, for whatever works for my playing. That actually sounds pretty natural. I could also add more or less depth. Now obviously this is kind of going up and down in pitch as well, so. But we can pretty much find something that's going to allow our transitions to sound more natural with that vibrato. So really cool function. Even if we were to play like a full chord. There's lots of fun to be had there for even special effects, but one of the things I was really happy about that is if I was to sustain a note and vibrate it, I can have it blend in a much more natural fashion, which was really, really cool. Okay, effects level, obviously, let's say that we were playing something where we were going to sustain a note. But we wanted that note a little quieter. We just used the effects level for that. Where it's still sustaining, but it's going to be at a quieter volume. So that's a much needed parameter. Random depth and random speed. Okay, so let's see what happens here. What happens with the modulation? Let's put a good bit of modulation going here. So what the rand depth and rand speed does, it kind of controls how much randomization is going to be brought into our droning note, okay? And it can work really nicely to make a more natural sound with the mod freq and the mod depth, okay? So some really interesting things we can have there. It's going to be the depth of the randomization and then the speed, how fast it's going to randomize things, okay? So some really cool things going on here. Now you might say, what are some of the uses for this? Well, one of the things I thought about is one of my favorite guitar solos of all time by the great Alex Lifeson from Rush with their song Limelight. You know, we have this beautiful solo, you know, however that goes. But that's a cool function there where we hear Alex sort of just sustain that note off into eternity sort of thing, right, while he goes back to his rhythm playing. So something like that would be very cool. And what I could do on something like that is sort of have the attack come in right away. Maybe the effects level down a little bit just because we want that rhythm to pop after. I'm going to have the modulation set around here so that it actually continues with some vibrato, but I'm going to bring the decay up to maybe 5 seconds. We'll add a little bit of randomization depth and speed and see how that works on that. And you see when I turned it off, it had that 5-second fade, so it sounded very natural. It didn't just chop off. So that's a really cool function for that. So we could play around with those things for notes like that at the end of the solo that we want to continue to keep going for however long we want it. We can also set that switch to momentary if we wanted, and it's only going to hold for as long as we hold the switch down. So that's another possibility for that if we so desired. But what about more creative things? Well, using something like the interval setting might be a very cool effect as well. Let's take this and we'll drop it down an octave, let's say. And let's say I just drone a low E note. We could drone a note of a totally different pitch. So that's kind of cool to create an interesting drone. But what if we did this? What if we went over to our bypass controller assign page, and instead of setting the bypass as the only thing to the switch, set the interval, and we'll set that to, let's say, foot switch 8. And I'm going to say that on the minimum setting, which is when we turn it off, I am going to have that set at the -12 that I had set. And for the max, I'm going to set it -5. Okay, so what we see now is if I turn this on, we have the interval in brackets now. And when I hit my interval switch, it goes between -12 and -5. So let's create this drone again with the low E. Now what happens when I hit the switch that I set up for my intervals? And we can have that sustain away, long, short, whatever we want. Some really cool stuff. This might even be cool on some higher notes. So the more we think about these controls, how we can assign them to maybe expression pedals, foot switches, maybe our mod depth to an expression pedal, some foot switches to change different things around, we see there's some very cool things we can have going with the poly sustain effect. And I'm just scratching the surface here. I'm sure there's many more folks out there that are far more creative than I. And once they understand how these functions work, they're going to be able to come up with all sorts of amazing, new and wonderful sounds. So yet another amazing block that maybe some of us have overlooked that we should maybe mess around with, because there are some really cool functions going on in this poly sustain. One thing to keep in mind, it is a mono only block, okay? Now another thing is we might say, well, where should we place this? Should we place it before or after the amp? So obviously I was using it after it was working fine, but I could also throw this before and see what happens. You're gonna have to make up your mind. I'm kind of digging it a little bit after. It seems to smooth things out and keep things more like I would want it. But again, it's no right or wrong here, you know. We can, with a lot of the poly effects, using it before the amp gets a nice sort of non-harmonically rich, clean sound for it to act off of. So for this one though, I find I kind of personally prefer it after the amp. But again, you know what, no right and wrong. You guys can do whatever works best for you. Thank you guys so much for listening in. I hope that was helpful, and I hope that will spark some interest in this wonderful new block that we have in this firmware 3.0 update, which is really, really cool. So many amazing functions. And again, a super huge thank you and hats off to the folks at Line 6 for doing such a bang up job with this and giving us so much more in our Helix HX Stomp native, you know, for us to work with. So thanks again, guys. Please like the video, share it with anybody who you think would enjoy it and get some use out of it. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Hit the little bell notification to get notified when I put new content out. I will be back really soon with some more content. Thank you guys so much again for tuning in. Ciao for now.